It was a dark evening in February 1983 when three armed, masked gunmen arrived to the home of Jim Fitzgerald. His family were locked in a room, and he was taken at gunpoint to a nearby stable. One of the men said to him, "We have come for Shergar. We want 2 million for him." The horse was loaded into a horsebox and never seen again. What followed was a mystery which captivated the people of Ireland and many others around the world in the hunt to locate Shergar, the world's most famous racehorse. This is the Troubles Podcast, a podcast which explores the violence and bloodshed that occurred in Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, and Great Britain, as multiple sides and organisations waged a bloody conflict over the status of Northern Ireland. Horse racing has been hugely popular in Ireland for hundreds of years and around the world. Ireland is very much perceived as a horse nation. It is one of the most popular spectator sports in the country, and on the international scene, Ireland has been one of the strongest producers and trainers of thoroughbred horses in the world. In 2022, horse breeding and racing contributed around €2.46 billion to the Irish economy, and there are around 30,000 people in Ireland working in this industry. When it comes to geology and climate, Ireland is an ideal country to raise a young horse, and it is quite common for a horse to be owned by somebody outside of Ireland but grazed in Ireland. This brings us to Shergar the horse. Born and raised in Ireland on March the 3rd, 1978, he was a thoroughbred colt. His father was a horse by the name of Great Nephew, who was a British stallion who had a number of wins to his name. Shergar was spirited and had one funny eye, and he didn't look like a horse that would be faster than any other. Shergar was owned by one of the richest men in the world, Aga Khan IV. He is considered to be a direct descendant of the Prophet Muhammad and the religious leader of all of the world's Ismaili Muslims, of which there are around 50 million. He owned a number of studs around the world, including one in Ireland. In 1980, Shergar was 2 years old and he had his first 2 races, of which he won both. Then by the time he was 3, he had filled out and had begun to enter his prime. In horse racing, the unit of measurement for distance between horses is known as a length. One length is around 8 to 9 feet. And in most races, the margin can be quite tight when the horses cross the finish line. But time and time again, Shergar was winning by huge lengths. On the 3rd of June 1981, Shergar took part in the Epsom Derby, and it was this race that he is perhaps most well known for. He pulled away from the rest of the group, who never caught up, and won the race by a margin of 10 lengths, which was the largest winning margin of any Epsom Derby. One commentator said of Shergar during the race, "There's only one horse in it, and you need a telescope to see the rest." After this race, a group of horse owners in the US offered the Aga Khan $40 million for Shergar, which he refused. Instead, he syndicated Shergar for £10 million. This basically meant that ownership of the horse was divided up into 40 stocks, each stock with a value of £250,000. So like a company, different groups could own a percentage of Shergar. The Aga Khan kept 6 stocks for himself and sold the remainder to individual buyers. This was a record price at the time. Shergar's vet, Irishman Stan Cosgrove, was offered a share in the horse and took them up on the offer.
When I bought a share, I was very privileged and very happy to be allowed to get a share. I mean, there were only 40 shares, and I was allowed to have a share. The Aga Khan allowed me to have a share. It was 250,000 sterling for a share, and you had, I think, 4 years to pay it. I consider it to be a gilt-edged investment at that price.
Continuing a strong year, Shergar raced in Ireland at the Irish Derby on June 27, 1981, where he again won by a strong margin, leading his jockey to announce that Shergar was one of the best horses he had ever raced on. It's hard to really describe it, but by this stage, Shergar was a household name in the UK and Ireland, and he was universally loved. He raced his final race on September the 12th, 1981, and surprised everyone by coming in fourth. Tests were ran on him to see if anything was wrong, and in the end the Aga Khan decided to retire him, saying, quote, "He was just an exceptional athlete. All through the spring and summer, he completely dominated European racing in a very dramatic manner. And after he had run so uncharacteristically in the Saint Leger, we knew something had gone wrong, but we didn't know what it was. So it was an easy decision to retire him." The Aga Khan decided to put Shergar to stud at the Ballymanny stud near the town of Newbridge in Kildare, Ireland. Upon Shergar's arrival to Newbridge, he was paraded down the street. Shergar was more of a household name than some human athletes by this stage. There was plenty of money to be made racing Shergar, but breeding him would prove to be incredibly profitable as well. The fee for a day to pair a mare with Shergar, the champion stallion, was around £70,000, and there was no guarantee that a mare would become pregnant that day. By 1982, Shergar was Europe's top stud, fathering 37 foals, which then sold for record amounts. Then in 1983, a new stud season was about to begin. Shergar was fully booked and had a very busy season ahead of him. But that all changed on the 8th of February. It was around 8:30 in the evening at the Ballymanny stud in Kildare. Nearby at Goff's, a large horse sale had taken place on the same day, so there were a lot of horse boxes and trailers on the road all over Ireland. It was the perfect smokescreen to steal a horse. Earlier in the day, Shergar had been taken out for some exercise and then returned to his stable by his groom, Jim Fitzgerald. Here is Jim describing what happened next.
I went around normally to have a look at the horses, like I would after I'd have a meal, just in case they'd be hanging around with them, you know. So I went around them normally and had a look at them and then went back. But it was just a normal evening until this happened.
Jim was in his house with his family when 3 men burst into his home, all wearing masks. It's believed that they were part of a group of between 6 and 9 men. One of the men had a pistol, and another said to Jim, "We have come for Shergar. We want 2 million for him." While 2 men guarded Jim's family, Jim was taken from his house to the stable where Shergar was. He was then told to load Shergar into a horsebox. Jim then lay on the floor of a car with a coat covering his head, and he was driven around for a number of hours. He wasn't sure if the men intended to kill him or not. He was eventually released near the town of Kilcock in Kildare. He was warned not to contact the Gardaí or his family would be killed. The gang then gave him a code word, King Neptune, and they would use that code the next time they got in contact with him. Jim didn't learn much more about the men. One of them spoke with a Northern Irish accent, and the other seemed to have experience with horses. The men never mentioned anything about being members of the Provisional IRA. Jim walked to the nearest village and got in contact with his brother, and then he eventually made it back home by midnight. This next part is a bit complicated and ended up wasting a significant amount of time. Jim didn't want to contact the Gardaí because of what the kidnappers had threatened, so he contacted the stud manager instead. The stud manager then contacted Shergar's vet, Stan Cosgrove, who I mentioned earlier. Stan then contacted a friend in the horse racing business, who rang a local politician. The Aga Khan was also proving difficult to contact. Eventually they got through to him and he advised them to contact the Gardaí straight away. Finally, at 4 a.m, Stan then contacted the Gardaí. By the time the Gardaí had been contacted, Shergar had been taken for over 8 hours and the trail had gone cold. In those 8 hours, Shergar could have been taken anywhere in Ireland, or he even could have made it on a boat out of the country. News of the kidnapping broke at midday, and it was front page news in the UK and Ireland.
Britain's most valuable racehorse was stolen from a stud farm in the Irish Republic late last night.
Gunmen entered the stud around 9 o'clock last night. They held Mr. John Fitzgerald and his family in a back room at gunpoint.
Reactions were of shock and confusion. Why would anyone steal a horse? It wasn't long before the investigation began, with Chief Superintendent James Murphy being selected to lead the case. He was an interesting man who always wore a trilby hat and spoke with a distinctive accent. He had a wry sense of humour and would often make remarks to the press. Here's James speaking to the press.
Well, I'm slightly concerned about it. For the simple reason that a stallion cannot be kept by people who are not well up in the horsey field and who do not know how to keep the animal.
Do you have any leads at the moment?
I have no leads.
This was a major investigation and had upwards of 40 to 50 detectives working on the case, and the eyes of the world were upon them. So what was their first lead? Just 4 hours after Shergar's kidnapping, a horse breeder living near Belfast was awoken to the sound of her phone ringing. Here's Judy Maxwell.
Just shortly after midnight, on what subsequently turned out the evening he had been kidnapped, the phone rang and the voice said, "We've got Shergar. If you want proof, we'll send you his ear." At the time, we thought they were joking because there had been nothing on the media. I think he'd only been kidnapped late on in the evening, a few hours before, so nobody knew that he'd been kidnapped, and I just presumed it was a hoaxer.
Then, a few minutes after the call was placed to Judy, the BBC in Belfast received a call. The caller spoke in what was described as an educated Southern Irish accent. He explained that they were holding Shergar and were willing to negotiate with 3 people, listing off the names of 3 racing journalists based out of London. Here's one of the journalists, Derek Thompson, talking about the importance of Shergar.
And remember, this is a horse that I'd not been brought up with, but I'd seen close at hand. To me, was a hero. You know, it's like a footballing hero you grew up with, sports hero, someone you really look up. To me, he was something very special. He was the best racehorse in the world.
This podcast would absolutely not still be here if it wasn't for the people on Patreon who have been supporting me. On Patreon, you can listen to episodes early, which are also ad-free. And I also release a companion video after most episodes, which would have additional information about the subject matter. I usually release a short video when there is significant news happening in Northern Ireland. We also have a book club, where we read a book, and then after a few weeks we have a group Zoom chat where we can talk about the book we are reading. If any of this sounds like your cup of tea, then you can subscribe over at patreon.com/The Troubles Podcast. Each and every supporter helps this podcast get one step closer to becoming a full-time job. Thanks for listening. Within hours, the 3 journalists had arrived to the Europa Hotel in Belfast, ready to negotiate. A phone call then came into the hotel. It was the kidnappers. They were told to go to Maxwell Farmhouse, which had a significant police presence by then. They arrived at the farmhouse and waited. Eventually, shortly after 1 in the morning, the phone rang. Derek took the call. The man identified himself as the kidnapper and said Derek can call him Arkle from now on. Derek did his best to keep the man on the phone for as long as possible, as he believed that the police force, the RUC, were tracing the call. The call lasted 2 to 3 minutes before disconnecting. Derek turned to the police who were listening in and asked if that was long enough to be traced. The police responded, saying that the man who traces the calls went off duty at midnight. Arkle called again the next morning. He told them that Shergar had an accident and was dead, and hung up. So after all this effort, this lead quickly became a stub, and there was later speculation that all of this was simply a tactic adopted by the kidnappers to distract the authorities, while Shergar could be hidden away elsewhere. But there were other leads. A call was also placed to Shergar's stud farm, which he was kidnapped from. This time, the official codename was used, King Neptune, and the voice on the line said, "We want 2 million in 20s, 50s and 100s, £100 bill used notes." This was odd, because at the time £100 sterling notes did not exist. The voice also demanded a phone line in France, as they didn't want to make calls to other Irish phone numbers, presumably to prevent tracing. They were given the phone number for the Aga Khan's office in Paris. Over the next few days, a number of conversations took place between the kidnappers and those in the Aga Khan's office. The kidnappers would demand money, and the Aga Khan's office would say that they needed more time to talk with all the other shareholders. They also needed proof that the horse was still alive. Privately, the Aga Khan was against paying any sort of ransom, as he believed that if they paid for the safe return of Shergar, then it would make every high-value horse in Ireland a target. There was also no guarantee that Shergar would be returned at all, even if they paid the ransom. Now would probably be a good time to talk about what it takes to care for a horse like Shergar. He would have needed to be looked after by somebody with a lot of experience with horses. If he got agitated or upset in the horsebox, he could very easily break a leg, and a broken leg for a horse is a death sentence. In the wake of an absence of information, rumours about who kidnapped Shergar began to surface. One claimed that Shergar was kidnapped by the US Mafia after the Aga Khan refused to sell Shergar to them years earlier. Or perhaps an Arab horse breeder smuggled them out of Ireland to a secret stud elsewhere. Some even claimed that it was the Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi who had stolen him. There was also one claiming that it was an inside job, as Shergar had not bred very successful horses and would not make a return on other investments. It was a very bizarre time where anything was jumped upon by the tabloids. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the syndicate was trying to get proof that Shergar was indeed alive, and the Aga Khan's office was still in touch with the supposed kidnappers on the phone. The voice said that they were to send someone to the Crofton Hotel in Dublin and to use the name Johnny Logan at reception, which was the name of a famous singer. There would be an envelope waiting for them, with proof that Shergar was still alive. It has now been 4 days since the horse's disappearance. Shergar's vet, Stan Cosgrove, became an integral character in this story. He was asked to go to the hotel. Unbeknownst to him, armed members of the Gardaí Special Branch were covertly watching him as he approached the hotel. He approached reception and asked if there was a message for Johnny Logan, to which they said no. A phone call then came into the Aga Khan's office from the kidnappers, who were furious, saying they couldn't deliver the letter to the hotel because it was surrounded by Gardaí. It is unclear if they ever intended to deliver any proof that Shergar was alive. Later that day, they called back, providing another hotel where there would be proof that Shergar was alive. This time, the proof came in the form of a close-up photograph of a horse's head, beside a newspaper with the current date on it. Stan was certain that the photo was indeed Shergar, but he wasn't convinced that this was proof enough that he was still alive. The kidnappers continued to increase the pressure on the Aga Khan's office, who continued to stall while demanding more concrete proof that Shergar was still alive. There was a legitimate concern that the Aga Khan would bring his business elsewhere, away from Ireland, as a result of this kidnapping. If he did, would others follow? There was a lot of money and jobs in the horse breeding market in Ireland. 200,000 Irish farmers were encouraged to search their fields, and the Gardaí were inundated with phone calls and tips from the public. Most of them led nowhere. This was a huge news story, and media organisations from around the world had boots on the ground in Ireland. But as time went on, there was little to no information. The Aga Khan continued to stall with the kidnappers, and there was little belief that he would pay to secure the release of Shergar. Again, if the ransom was paid, it was a sign that these kidnappings worked, which is something the Aga Khan and any other horse owner in Ireland would not want. By now the kidnappers must have realised that they stood no chance of getting the £2 million ransom that they were demanding. So what would become of Shergar? The public waited and waited, with no more contact from the kidnappers. After 2 weeks, the police search was scaled back, though the investigation continued. Then, 8 weeks later, something strange happened. This one has very little detail online, and the sources are a little bit conflicting. So bear with me. A man by the name of Dennis Minogue came forward to the Gardaí saying that he had a contact within the IRA who could get Shergar released for a fee of £80,000. The Gardaí then went to vet Stan Cosgrove and asked for his help in talking with the IRA. Minogue claimed that he had been blindfolded and brought to see Shergar. He described Shergar to Cosgrove, which led Cosgrove to believe that Minogue had indeed seen Shergar. He said, quote, "He gave me details about the horse which convinced me. This sounds quite vague, but Minogue went on to describe a hoof condition which Shergar had, something which was only known to Cosgrove. The Gardaí decided to launch a sting operation and used real money to lure the kidnappers out. So on July 20th, 1983, a detective put £80,000 in the boot or trunk of his car in a village in the Irish county of Clare. He then walked to a rendezvous point. When he returned to the car later that day, or the following day, it's unclear, the boot had been forced open and the money was gone, with no sign of Shergar. The Irish Gardaí had been embarrassed and swindled out of £80,000, and they made an attempt to cover up this botched sting operation. It appears that Dennis Minogue was considered a trusted informant to the Gardaí and had previously provided a tip-off which had led to the arrest of an INLA suspect. He had also warned his handler up to 6 months before the kidnapping of Shergar that the IRA were planning on stealing a valuable horse to ransom, and that a horsebox had been stolen and a number of dummy runs had been carried out. It appears that Minogue was compromised as an informer after he told his handler, a detective, that a Gardaí's son was in the IRA. It's believed that this information was leaked by someone in the Irish Gardaí back to the IRA, and Minogue was abducted and tortured but not killed. But once he was compromised as an informer, his handler wouldn't take any of the information he provided to other Gardaí, for risk of the Gardaí leaking the information again to the IRA, who would then kill Minogue. So this information about the IRA planning to kidnap a horse, which was provided 6 months before Shergar's disappearance, was never submitted. The detective involved in this attempted sting operation grew disillusioned with the Gardaí, believing that some of them were leaking information to the IRA, and he was later fired for his role in this botched sting operation. So back to Shergar. By the end of 1983, there was little hope that he would be recovered, so insurance companies began to pay out the members of the syndicate who owned a share in Shergar. But unfortunately for the vet, Stan Cosgrove, he would not see any of this insurance money. He had one share in Shergar, which cost him £250,000, which would be around €700,000 in today's money. He did have an insurance policy with Shergar, but unlike other owners, that policy did not cover theft, only death. His insurance provider would only pay out if Stan provided proof that Shergar was dead, something which he was unable to do. £250,000 was a significant sum of money for Stan, compared to some of the other investors in the horse, and it was in his best interest to find Shergar, dead or alive. But as the months turned into years, the trail quickly ran cold. The kidnapping of Shergar became legend, and rumours of the horse popping up around the world continued, with very little tangible evidence. Then, in the year 2000, there was a lead. In a remote part of County Kerry, a horse's skull was discovered, with 2 bullet holes in its head. Could this be Shergar? 2 bullet holes in the head would have been consistent with how a vet would have killed a horse in Ireland in the 80s, so it wasn't necessarily indicative that there was foul play involved. Testing revealed that the horse was 2 years old, and since Shergar was 5 when he was kidnapped, there was no way this skull was his. By this stage, Stan Cosgrove was sick and tired of talking about Shergar and had yet to receive a penny. As the decades wore on, small bits of information did trickle out, which was not initially revealed to the public at the time of the kidnapping. In the 2004 RTE documentary Who Killed Shergar, it was revealed that a magazine from an automatic rifle had been discovered near a wall where Shergar was discovered. This rifle had been used by the Provisional IRA in South Armagh, so Gardaí at the very least believed that the operation was carried out by the Provisional IRA. In the years since the end of the Troubles, many aspects of different attacks and kidnappings remain relatively unknown. And over the years, many ex-paramilitaries have written books and memoirs about their time as a paramilitary. Not everyone agrees with what is written in these memoirs, but one example which is relevant to this episode is the book The Informer by Sean O'Callaghan. O'Callaghan was a member of the Provisional IRA, but in reality he was a secret agent working for the Irish government and the Garda Special Branch. In his book, he made a number of claims which have been disputed. In one instance, he wrote that he attended an IRA finance meeting in Letterkenny in Donegal in 1980, and in attendance was politician Gerry Adams and solicitor Pat Finucane. Gerry Adams has continued to maintain that he was not a paramilitary during the Troubles, and Pat Finucane's family do not believe that he was a member of the Provisional IRA. O'Callaghan made a number of assertions in his book regarding what happened to Shergar. He claimed that it was IRA member Kevin Mallon's idea to steal the horse. He wrote that Mallon believed that kidnapping a horse would cause less of a public outcry than kidnapping a person. Quote, "There would be no father, mother, husband or wife tearfully begging for a loved one's release." O'Callaghan then wrote about meeting Provisional IRA man Jim Fitzgerald in a park in Dublin, where Gerry told him what happened to Shergar. He named a number of people involved in the operation and described what happened on the night Shergar was taking, saying that he was loaded into a horsebox and then driven to the Irish county of Leitrim. But things started to go wrong almost immediately. They had brought along a man who had worked with horses to help Shergar, but working with horses and dealing with a thoroughbred horse are two very different things. Shergar threw himself into a frenzy in the horsebox and injured his left leg. He was then shot within days, or possibly hours, of his kidnap. In the eyes of the Provisional IRA, this operation was a failure. They had assumed that the Aga Khan was the sole owner of the horse, which was incorrect. They had also probably misjudged him somewhat, as he had absolutely no intention of paying the ransom from the outset. They had also grossly underestimated how beloved Shergar was as a horse. As well as that, Shergar was kidnapped during stud season, where he was meant to be mating with mares. But the odds are high that a stallion in stud would have been extremely difficult to deal with. And O'Callaghan also mentioned that even trying to kill a stallion in stud would be difficult, and a clean shot to the head could be almost impossible to do to a terrified, demented horse. There was a rumour I came across saying that the horse was machine gunned to death, which sounds a bit far-fetched. So where is Shergar? Well, in 1983, businessman Don Tidy was kidnapped in another extortion attempt by the Provisional IRA. This was another botched operation, and he was discovered being held captive in a forest in a remote part of Leitrim. Leitrim is a sparsely populated county with some dense forestry and a significant history of IRA activity. Gardaí have confirmed that they believe that this is the most likely place where Shergar met his end. That or the county of Cavan. But for some it was too late. Stan Cosgrove died on August 29, 2019. In the wake of the Shergar kidnapping, Cosgrove faced significant financial hardship and he was forced to sell his farm. But this didn't affect him from having a prosperous career throughout his life as a vet. He did approach O'Callaghan and hoped that an affidavit from him stating what had happened to the horse would be enough for the insurance company, but it wasn't. Upon hearing the news of Cosgrove's death, Brian Kavanagh, the chief executive of Horse Racing Ireland, said that he was one of the most gifted equine veterinarians. As a way of honouring Shergar, the Shergar Cup was introduced in 1999, which pitted European jockeys against jockeys from the Middle East. A statue honouring Shergar also stands in one of the Aga Khan's Irish studs, Giltown Stud. As of writing, there have been searches in bogs over the years, but there has still not been any trace found of Shergar. The Provisional IRA have still not confirmed if they did indeed kidnap him, and it remains one of the most well-known unsolved mysteries in Ireland. It would appear that the trail has gone cold, and will remain so. There is no doubt that there are still those alive who know where Shergar is buried. Maybe even some of you listening do. If you do, let me know. Though the odds are higher that this will be one mystery lost to the sands of time. That's it from me. Thanks, and see you next time.
Shergar's going for the guns. He's gone 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 lengths clear. Shotgun swirls under pressure. 2 furlongs out. The Derby is a procession. Shergar is 10 lengths clear. Titillating Air gets into second place. Church Parade and Shotgun. Clinton Gold come next. There's only one horse in it. You need a telescope to see the rest. They have a problem to go. And Shergar is galloping them into the ground. 15 lengths at least. Wally Swinburne looks round. He's on his own. Shergar, clear of his field. He's climbed this mountain. He has eased up. Shergar wins the Derby.